And right now, from National Review, our friend Charles Cooke joins us on the program. Charles, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am excellent. So yesterday was an interesting day. Yesterday morning, we had the news that gun control advocates in Congress were looking to revive the background check proposals. And yesterday afternoon, we had a survey out by Pew Research showing support for the Second Amendment and the right to keep bear arms, the highest it's been in 20 years, including, by the way, Charles, erosion of support in gun control among Democrats, all but liberal Democrats.
Yes, it was a nice combination. Unfortunately, I wrote up my response to the news that the Democrats were, I shouldn't say the Democrats, some Democrats were hoping to push gun control before that statistic, but that statistic is not new. I think I've probably been on your show before arguing that we are at a 20-year high. It's not just a general warmth towards the Second Amendment, but it's specific. There are a record number of people who believe that having a firearm in one's house makes that house safer. There are a record number of people who are against handgun bans. And there are a record number of people who don't want the law to change. I think that one is important because, although this is a complex area, we're told 90% of Americans want background checks on private sales. And yet when you look at the Gallup question, which is, do you want the manner in which firearms are sold to change, not even 50% say yes. I do understand that people differ when you present them with different questions. But this is not a pressing concern. And if the Democratic Party genuinely reacts to having diminished its standing in Congress significantly, to having lost the South almost completely, and to having weakened itself at the state level to an extent that it has not felt since the Depression, if it reacts to those developments by pushing for more gun control, frankly, it needs its head looking at.
That is a very good way of putting it, Charles. And you're right. And here's the thing. I mean, I think that you'll agree with me that in a perfect world, both political parties would respect and work to strengthen and secure the right of law-abiding Americans to keep and bear arms. This should be a nonpartisan issue. And as recently as, again, a few years ago, you could point to pro-gun Democrats in Congress from various parts of the country. It has become much more difficult to do that over the last couple of election cycles. And you point out the piece by Tim Carney on why and how the Democrats lost the South. What's fascinating is that there's this argument going on in the left right now, Charles, of we don't need that swath of the country. Right, we don't need those states, and I guess soon the rationale will be, well, we don't need those icky Rust Belt voters anyway. They were the bitter clingers, and we don't need people in the Great Plains because those are flyover states. In essence, there's an argument right now. We don't need anybody but people who think like we do, and according to Pew, 80% of self-described liberal Democrats say it's more important to control gun ownership than it is to protect the rights of gun owners, and frankly they're the real outlier across the country.
Well, that's absolutely right. There was a subtext, I think, that wasn't so much of a subtext in Tim Carney's piece, and that is that it's not just that many Democrats don't need to win the South, rather, but don't want to.
Right.
There were some incredible quotes in Tim's piece. We all know famous one from President Obama, the bitter clingers line. And I don't have it in front of me, but there was a line in there about Southerners clinging to their firearms on their, flea-infested sofas on their rotting porches. Now, that's a very different argument from either we need background checks on private sales or the Democratic Party doesn't need to focus on the South. That's animosity towards a large part of the country, indeed a growing part of the country. The demographic change in the last 10 years, and it doesn't seem to be changing, is toward the South. It's gaining whites, it's gaining Hispanics, it's gaining African Americans. to talk about a part of the country like that strikes me as being intolerant. I would not have reacted, I have to say, if I were at the DNC, to the loss in these midterms going into 2016 by disparaging a good number of Americans and by going after an issue that is increasingly toxic for the left.
Yeah, no, I think this is. I was going to say I was about to say it's an unforced error, but it's not, because I think what it is again, on the progressive press, they love to talk about the infighting among the right and look at the conservatives tear each other apart, the libertarians and the social cons, and and the Tea Party and the establishment. They love to talk about that, but there is that real division within the left as well, and the different wings of the Democrat Party. As I said, I would love to see both parties. I'd love to go to a poll on Election Day, walk into the ballot booth and say, "Oh, good, 2 A-rated candidates. That's fantastic." I would love that as a gun owner.
Yes. Well, I think what you're getting at here is that there is a big difference between the words progressive and liberal and the word Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's true on the right as well. As you say, there are many factions on the right. Also, not everybody who calls himself a Republican is a conservative in the sense that we might understand the word, although I would say there are far more self-described conservatives than self-described liberals or progressives. But there are many, many Democrats in the United States who pull the lever for the Democratic candidate but have no interest in gun control, and indeed are not greatly motivated by some of the fringe issues that progressives are interested in. Instead, maybe they are a member of a union. Maybe they are in favor of a higher minimum wage. Maybe they want to protect Social Security. Maybe they like Obamacare, although I'm yet to meet many outside of New York who do. They're not generally agitated about gun control either way, and I think this is probably the mistake that progressives and self-described liberals make, is that because New York and California and Boston and Ann Arbor are interested in gun control, that the average person who voted for Barack Obama or votes for Democrats in the Senate and in the House is. It's simply not true. There's very little motivation there. So if they want to go ahead with this, they can try it, but they failed to do it when they had the Senate, when they had the presidency, just after an abomination at Sandy Hook. I don't think it's going to work this time.
You know, and to that end, Charles, I mean, you write about this in your piece, that in essence, what they have, their argument has not changed. I saw a story yesterday that the argument right now, as we come up to the anniversary of the murders at Sandy Hook Elementary, is in fact, I read a piece of yours that you wrote in 2013 on the show yesterday, and I was about a paragraph and a half in before I realized that this was a year old, because their argument is exactly the same. It's we haven't done anything since Sandy Hook. How could we be such a cold, uncaring, calloused country to not act and not do something in Congress after the murders there at that elementary school?
Well, you know, there's a line I quote often from Kathleen Kennedy, who said the reason that the bill went down in 2013, the reason that Toomey Manchin failed to push their bill through the Senate, was that it had nothing to do with Sandy Hook, and everybody knew it.
Right.
And whatever the merit of background checks on private sales, and we can debate these separately some other time. I lay out the argument, I think fairly in my post, the manner in which this is presented by the left. It has nothing to do with school shootings. The fact is, most people who shoot up schools are not allowed to own firearms because they're too young, which means that they're not buying firearms in any sense. Any purchase or transfer or possession would be illegal. Most mass shooters as well simply don't go through private sales. Most of them go to gun stores and they buy them legally from an FFL, or they go through a federal background check. Some of them steal the guns. Others take them from their parents or from their friends. occasionally you see a black market transaction, but again, that's away from the system. Mass shootings, school shootings, and background checks on private sales are unrelated. But I think progressives know that the only way that they can get a hearing in a country that is increasingly skeptical of gun control is to point to abominable things that have happened, those pictures that we saw on the news, and say, I'm trying to stop that. Now, I think most people know that they're not, but at the edges, they maybe gain a little more traction than they would otherwise.
Well, they may, although, again, the poll results we've seen this year from both Gallup and now Pew would suggest not much. I mean, honestly,
No.
What it would suggest is that they are more and more Americans, more men, more women, more millennials, more people in their 40s and on up, are all sort of rejecting that point of view. I mean, according to Pew, the two demographics that didn't see any shift at all towards a pro-Second Amendment point of view are self-described liberal Democrats and Hispanic Americans.
Right. Although it was interesting that black Americans have become increasingly pro-Second Amendment across the time period that was gauged.
Yeah, a 25-point swing.
It's remarkable. Again, it's a spectacular failure on behalf of those who have been trying to sell gun control. And I think it's worth saying, without sounding too triumphalist, that beyond that 20-year span, the movement in the center of gravity on this issue has been astonishing. In the 1980s, as you know as well as I do, it wasn't popular, but there was at least serious discussion of a total handgun ban. Presidential candidate in 1988, had tried to shepherd through a total handgun ban in Massachusetts. It just failed. In the 1950s and 60s, majorities thought that handguns should be restricted to police. In the early 1990s, Ronald Reagan signed on, not literally, he was obviously an ex-official, but signed on to the assault weapons ban. He backed the Brady Bill. He argued for more gun control. This is unthinkable now. That's a remarkable shift.
It is. And you look at the last 2 years in particular, Charles, where we have seen certainly President Obama, leading members of Congress, almost every celebrity that you could imagine, media outlets all over the place, otherizing gun owners and gun ownership. Again, every opportunity they can. Bob Costas at halftime of a football game lecturing us that it's time to revisit our gun laws here. And with all of that going on, as you say, we've still seen that shift. Frankly, I wonder if a lot of this isn't because Americans don't like being lectured to. They don't like being scolded. They don't like being told that it's not actually the criminal who's committing these crimes, but they, in fact, are the sickness and disease in this country. I mean, it really, it's not actually a very winning message, Charles.
Well, no, and this goes back to what we started with, which is the overt dislike of gun owners, of people who want to own guns, of people who defend the Second Amendment, as expressed in some of the columns that Tim Carney was quoting.
I found that quote, by the way, if you'd like the exact one.
Yes, go for it.
Okay. I had it, and I lost it. It was from Gene Weingarten, from the Washington Post, and yeah, I've now lost it. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Well, no, the problem with it is that if you are sitting in a New York City restaurant and you say, people who want to own firearms are these toothless, stupid hicks who live on a creek somewhere in Mississippi and worship their Confederate flags. If you say that, maybe the people around the table will not. But almost everywhere else in the country, people say, well, hang on a minute, my neighbor has a gun, and we're friends. My son has a gun. My brother-in-law has a gun. I know that they're not like that. I reject this characterization. I mean, without putting too fine a point on it, I have a gun. I have 3. I'm an Oxford-educated British immigrant. And most of the gun owners that I know, black, white, Hispanic, men, women, they're the whole country in microcosm. So when you turn around and pretend that gun ownership is allied to some sort of social degeneracy, in a country with 300, 400 million privately owned guns, and in which a good number of the households own firearms, and in which most people grew up around firearms in some way or another, they know that that's not true. It's not an effective way of arguing.
Talking with Charles Cooke. Listen, Charles, it's always a pleasure spending some time with you, sir. I appreciate it. Hope we can do it again soon.
Love to.
All right. Have a wonderful weekend. We appreciate it, and we'll talk with Charles Cooke here before long.